Hi, everybody. Good evening. It is April 15th, 2015. Happy Tax Day. So, tonight's webinar actually was a request of Stephanie's, my moderator this evening. And right when she mentioned it, I knew it was the right thing to talk about. It's a theme that I just had a personal experience with over the weekend with about 120 professionals, and I'm going to share some of those stories as I move through the webinar this evening. And I think it's a theme that's really central and crucial to the treatment process for our children in the program, but also for their parents. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about vulnerability. It is that sense, that nakedness, that lack of protectedness that we feel like we're going to be rejected or that we're not going to fit in. It's a fear of not being loved, wanted. It's a fear of not being enough, a feeling of inadequacy or being judged in the process. But ultimately, after all of that, it's a fear, it's an experience that we're exposing ourselves, parts of ourselves in such a way that we're going to be outcast, that we're going to be forgotten and alone in this process. And so what we do in life is we build up defenses, we build up pretense, we develop parts of ourselves to cover up our true self. And we do this, as I talk about this tonight, we do this in response to some of our original contexts in life. So I'll talk about that as we move along. I'm going to talk about the interplay between our resistance, our defenses, and our shame. And I asked this question years ago of field staff. What's the difference between an explanation when somebody gives you feedback or approaches you and a defense? And the answer is that the defense is given because the threat or the fear of something being attacked or not liked or loved. So and it's only a question that can be answered by the person giving it. And one easy test is that if you ask somebody to stop explaining themselves, if the person isn't feeling threatened, it's easy to let go of. And to the extent that the person isn't comfortable letting it go without an explanation, then you know that there's a perceived threat there. So there has to be some kind of threat to the psyche, some kind of threat of rejection or judgment in that process. And this is an important point. I hear people use the word resistance throughout the years. And resistance looks like anything. It comes in lots of forms. It can come in hyper cooperation. It can come in apathy. It can come, of course, in a more classic kind of hostile, oppositional way. But resistance is anything that we do, that we exhibit, that we display, that we embody, that protects us from really getting down to that core self. And so if somebody is really cooperative around behavior or introjecting, which means swallowing the feedback or the ideas that they're getting from another person whole without challenging them, without asking tough questions, if they're doing that, that can all be seen as resistance. And I think most of the time we think about it in terms of lying, denial, and maybe most classically oppositionality. It's essentially our inability to or unwillingness to explore deeper parts of ourselves or to let them be explored by anybody else. And shame, the reason, and I talk about this in the shame webinars, and those of you who have seen webinars, you know this is my favorite topic. Shame is the urge, the experience of wanting to hide. And so when we think about shame, and guilt for that matter, because guilt is kind of a lesser version of shame, when we think about it in those terms, it doesn't lead over the long run to healthy behavior change. It might temporarily lead to behavior that is more socially acceptable or acceptable in a circumstance, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the healing. So shame, the way we know whether we're in a good place or not, is if we're willing to do something that exposes us, that is vulnerable, that is honest with ourselves and with others. And when we attempt to cover it up, even when that's cooperative behavior, we're really responding from a place of shame. So shame doesn't motivate us, guilt doesn't motivate us in many cases to do the right thing, but it serves to protect us from a perceived threat. Shame is the urge to go away, to hide, to put away those parts of ourselves that others found upsetting, off-putting, repulsive, frustrating, etc. And we learn this as children. We learn that when our parents or others were frustrated, upset, that they didn't like something about us, or even were not happy with themselves around us, we learn to shift who we were to be able to fit in, to be able to reduce that feeling, that experience of displeasure in the lives of our parents or on the face of our parents. So this, of course, becomes very important to us as parents to recognize that that is the impact that our emotional expression can have on our children. I was thinking about this just the other day. If I were going to run a psychodrama, that is a role play to try to help somebody move through an experience, and I was going to have them talk about or go back into their early childhood, what I would do is I would create some sort of figure that was about 12 feet tall that they had to talk to. Because for the 5, 6, and 7 year old, that's the equivalent perspective that they have with us. We are psychologically and physically giants to them. And so our emotional response, even our frustration, even our exhaustion at times, is very easily digested or internalized by a child who doesn't have a fully developed sense of separate self. It's very easy for them to interpret that as I did something wrong. And maybe what's more damaging than that is as our children grow up, many of us, all of us for that matter, have a common instinct to want to share with or get very emotionally around our children when they're doing something that we believe is unhealthy or at times even just unpleasant. Because we want to shape them back into, have them conform back into something that makes us feel a sense of serenity. This is essentially why I always talk about not trying to control our children emotionally, but responding with behavioral consequences. This is why teaching parents about communication skills is about creating a presence and an awareness in them, not necessarily modifying behavior. So we learned as children what we needed to be to fit in, and we've been performing that role ever since. We thought of it initially as taking care of ourselves, but eventually it can be, or essentially it can be seen as taking care of everybody else in life. And so the wiring, the kind of programming that we create as parents for our children when we express ourselves powerfully, emotionally, sometimes even subtly at our children's behavior, doesn't necessarily lead to healing, although it can lead to some behavioral compliance. I was just discussing with my wife who had to run out, and my 2 children, 12 and 7, are upstairs. And she said, I'm worried that the children are going to interrupt you during your webinar. And I said, don't worry, I'll use intimidation, shame, and guilt because in the short term, even though it's not healthy in the long term, it's going to work in the short term to get them to not interrupt me during the webinar. And of course, I didn't do that, but it is that temptation for all of us all the time to try to modify behavior by getting bigger, by getting louder, by getting angrier. And essentially, we begin to create this unsafe experience for our children. And this is something I believe in strongly, that when we get angry, frustrated with our children, with anybody for that matter, we're losing contact with them. Because if we were truly connected to the other, and sometimes we just don't have the capacity, sometimes our resources or our energy is just depleted. And so when we get upset or exasperated at somebody, we're losing contact with them, because if we truly understood everything that was going on inside of them, why would we be upset? We would be perfectly understanding and empathic with them. But we don't. And that's evidence of us having lost contact with them. As a therapist, a part of my training is to learn to respect defenses. That is, to understand that the defenses that people exhibit help us to understand the wound and a deeper part of themselves. I had somebody ask me one time, how quickly can you come to understand somebody when you meet them? And of course, it's not automatic, and people have varying levels of sophisticated defensive. But you start to hear and see the way that people respond to the world and to you. You start to see the way they protect themselves, and that tells you something about their context. That tells you something about something that they learned, that they acquired, that helped them to adapt to a specific context. And ideally, as a therapist, as a parent, if we can see that, then we can follow that information, that we can look for that to lead us to where the hurt or where the wound is. And this is essentially part of what we're trying to teach clients and children and parents for that matter. That's why we don't come with a big fist and ram through people's defenses, because they're not ready for it. They're not capable at this point. They haven't developed the trust or the sense of safety or the strength to be able to deal with that raw experience. That's why sometimes in therapy, you'll have an experience with somebody where they open up and then the next week they'll miss their appointment, because there was this experience at the time that felt raw and vulnerable and somewhat healthy, but afterwards there was this intense fear that overtook them that leads them to want to run away or walk away for a period of time at least. So week to week, or if your children are home at this point, you hear about their progress, and we get impatient and we want them to learn what we think they need to learn and move along. But part of what we're trying to talk about with vulnerability is to give you an experience. I'm going to try to do that a little bit tonight, to give you some information or an experience where you can understand your own sense of vulnerability, and then as an extension of that, be able to understand what it's like for your children in this world of giants, in this world where they're just coming to know themselves, be their real authentic selves, and essentially heal in this process. There are, of course, regressions, relapses. I heard someone describe something less than a relapse as a flare up. A relapse being a pattern reemerges. A flare up is a couple of behaviors. So maybe relapse on a drug one time wouldn't be necessarily a relapse. It would be a flare up. But that might lead to a relapse. But a relapse is a series or a set or a pattern of behaviors or responses to the outside world that indicate that I'm off track again, that I'm going backwards, that I'm regressing back into a more primitive way of coping. And of course, and then there's progress. What we're trying to accomplish, all of us, is more than just behavior change. And this takes the rest of our lives. I heard somebody mention at a conference that we just hosted, I'm going to refer to it, it's called the Forum in Innovative Treatment Conferences that we at Evoke started last year and that we've continued this year. And I heard somebody describing this idea of, when can I get out of therapy? I don't want to be in therapy my whole life. And then I thought about it this way. I saw this funny cartoon the other day where somebody said, those really healthy and fit people that you see at the gym, I just want to walk up to them and say, you're done. You're finished. And of course, we know from the physical standpoint that that's insane, that we can never really arrive, that we're always, if we're going to have a healthy body, we have to adopt a healthy lifestyle. And so why is it when we think about emotional health, we don't realize the same thing? We don't stop learning or arrive. We continue to think. We continue to stretch ourselves. We continue, ideally, to put ourselves in situations, vulnerable situations, situations where we don't have control, where we don't know the answer, where we walk into a therapist's office again and again and again, where we walk into a meeting, where we read new books, where we travel, and we have experiences where the context changes and we have to learn to adapt to it, to grow. And old things in us are going to slough off and new things in us are going to emerge. So it's more than just behavior change. And there is a great deal of difficulty in generalizing because really it's not internalized, right? This takes a long time. Even after a successful Evoke and aftercare placement, it's going to take some while to generalize. It's going to take some while to practice and to experiment. And that's what a lot of our clients and students do. And time must pass. And that's why I encourage you all the time to take the we'll see attitude. And one of the greatest things I've ever heard someone say to me when I was struggling is, I have faith in you. I know you'll figure it out. And usually my path towards figuring it out isn't always straight and isn't always clean. But to have somebody have that kind of faith in me is phenomenally empowering and healing and rewarding to me. So understanding the difficulty in generalizing these things. That's why you come back to the webinars. That's why you go back to meetings. That's why you go back to reading more books or having more sessions, is because it's difficult. We're really taking this packed in context of our childhood and trying to unpack it the rest of our lives. And it's not all mom and dad, but it's a lot mom and dad and siblings and the closer, the smaller community and then the greater community. And so time must pass. And there is no end to it. When you're done, that means you're not breathing anymore. That's when you know you're done. And understanding that what we're really doing, and I was thinking about this at our conference this weekend, is we're not working on behavior change. Behavior change can be the evidence of healing, but not always. Behavior change can be sometimes resistance. Because if I can change my behavior, then I don't have to go deeper. Then I don't have to explore those frightening parts of myself that I don't want to confront. And that could lead to all kinds of change or suggested change that I don't want to consider or deal with. So shifting just a little bit, and that'll kind of marry them together. Shifting to doing your own work. So what do? You go to therapy and you go to meetings. And I'll say it this way. You can't learn what you can learn in therapy and meetings any other way. It is an experience. And for those of you, and there are a lot on tonight, who have not been to meetings or therapy, ask yourselves, at least ask yourself, why haven't I? What am I afraid of? And when you start to list the excuses of why you haven't, understand that those sound a heck of a lot like the excuses that your child has for not trying things. And I'll get to that in a moment. The idea, and we've added this to our parent curriculum, of writing your life story and sharing it with at least one other person, and writing your own letter of accountability and sharing it with at least one other person. And many parents, I shouldn't say most, many parents are afraid to do this. They're afraid to put it down on paper. They're afraid to let anyone see it. Particularly, they're afraid to let their child see it. Why? Because then they're afraid that their child has leverage, power over them. And see, where there is power, there is no intimacy. To the extent that there's a power dynamic in a relationship, intimacy suffers. And where there is power and control, there is no vulnerability. So again, it's an inverse relationship between the two. And what I know about accountability, what I know about amends, what I know about owning my stuff, is that it really takes away power from anybody in my life away from them. Because I'm just being authentic. And so if I can put that out there, now if I'm still living in the power and control paradigm, then yes, I'm giving them leverage. But if I let go of that emotionally, then even if they attack me and blame me with it, my response is, it doesn't matter. This work that I'm doing around my accountability and my amends and making sense of my history is so personal, so much about me, that you can't really do anything to it. You can't really attack it. I can tell if you're trying to hurt me with it. I can tell if you're trying to use it against me or blame me. I can tell that. But to the extent that it is really my heart's work, there's nothing you can do. And then we begin to confront our own shame and our blame and our fear. I was just sitting, I'm going to skip a bullet point here. I was sitting at one of the panels at the Forum of Innovative Treatment Solutions Conference. And we were describing what we can do to create greater outcomes, right? What can we do from wilderness therapy and residential programs and even intensive outpatients to more mainstream success? And a lot of the focus began to be around doing family work, right? How can we support the family, help the family, the entire system change to reinforce and support the child, in this case, coming home and being successful? And somebody raised their hand and their response was, I think this focus, this incredible focus on family support and family treatment tends to lead me to believe that we're blaming the family. And I thought it was a worthy question. I think it's a good question. I think we should ask that. But my response to it is a two-part response. My first response is proximity-wise, proximally speaking. If I'm going to give somebody some tools to support the child back in the mainstream society, it would be best the parents and the family. They're the ones that are, proximately speaking, ideally, closest to that child forever. They'll always be there in their life, ideally speaking. And I said this to this person. I've met a lot of incredibly wonderful families, both in the context of treatment and out of it. And I almost never meet a family that I would consider really, really good at listening. And I would include myself in that many, many days. Let me say that again. I meet a lot of families in and out of treatment who are loving and what we would call in psychology good enough. And rarely do I meet families and individuals who really can listen well. And so just adding that skill, just practicing that skill, just making that skill part of the discipline of the family system. And it has deep roots in many areas. But adding that skill set and that discipline to a family is going to create at least one place that child who's struggling can go and be heard and be seen in the process. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is this idea of blame. Why does somebody's work, why does somebody's acknowledging, making amends, owning their stuff have to lead to this idea of blame? The older I get, the more I do this, the more I realize how much I impact my children in harmful ways, and in small ways and in subtle ways. And I have less a sense of blame and shame about it than I did when I thought I was a better parent. So this evolution, this growth about doing my work and owning my stuff doesn't add to my blame, doesn't take away my child's accountability. In fact, it makes it more solid and more clear, but just helps me to be a part of the solution. So we have to remove that, confront that as we move along. Like I said here, noticing your part, your resistance, your work, your relapse, your regressions, and your flare ups in the process. If that can be a part, again, of your daily discipline, and you can even demonstrate that in your relationships, it is such a model, such an example. More often, if we could just say, you know what, here's my issue around control, here's my issue around shame, this is why I got angry. It's not about you. This is why I raised my voice. This is why I hung up on you. This is why I tried to control you. Just now I was going to say something manipulative, or I said something manipulative 2 minutes ago. If we can make that a part of the culture of our family systems, of our lives, it is an incredibly powerful contribution to the healing of our entire system in this process, letting down that wall. And that means we're going to have to let go of the anger that protects us, and the resentment, and our sense that we're being cheated and that the world is unfair. All of those things serve to protect us from feeling hurt. Like I said, there's something. I had a friend for years, he's a therapist actually, and he would come to me and try to ask me to participate in the relationship as if I was his therapist. And I said to him, and after a while I became pretty blunt, I would just say, go to therapy. Just go to therapy. Just go to therapy. I'm not going to do this with you. And his response always was, I already know everything I need to know in my head. And what he didn't know and didn't understand, and what the person who hasn't accepted the invitation to go to an Al-Anon or a CODA meeting or a therapy session from Evoke Therapy or from me, what they haven't realized is that it's not about information. I've learned this in writing a book. Writing a book is not therapy. It is something entirely different. And so that experience, like Viktor Frankl says, when speaking of psychoanalysis, he said that therapy is a place that you go to listen to difficult things, and psychoanalysis, which is more like my version of therapy, is a place you go to say difficult things. It's something that you can learn, an experience that you can have that you can't have any other way. It's kind of like going to college. Imagine, and maybe this has happened to some of you, that you leave your hometown, you go away to college for 4 years, and you come back graduated, and you bump into an old acquaintance who has just stayed in that town and done the same thing and hasn't gone to college. It's different. Having a child and talking to somebody who's never had a child, it's different. And I could go on and on and on with experiences of adopting a child, losing a child, having a child that's a drug addict. It's hard to learn those pieces of life, those pieces of spirituality without the experience. And therapy is an experience, and walking into an Al-Anon meeting is an experience. And if nothing else, if doing your work for any of the reasons I've discussed doesn't work, there's one reason to do it. You do your work so that you know what it's like that you're asking your child to do. So when you have excuses, when you have defenses about going to meetings, about doing your work, about making amends, about whatever it is I'm talking about, you know just a little bit about what it's like when you hear the report, or you hear or watch the observation of your child and they're not doing their work and they're not going deeper. That's what it's like for them. And hopefully that experience can give you more empathy. In fact, when you walk into that meeting, walk into 6 meetings if you haven't. Sign up with a therapist if you haven't. And walk in there and remember what that feeling is like when you have to start filling up the session, or when you're asked to share in a meeting. This idea of not understanding your child, again, I see it as a defense. Now, there is genuine confusion, but there's also this frustration and judgment communicated by the expression, I don't understand them. If you don't understand your child, it is your work to understand them. It is your work to understand what's going on for them. And I'm not saying you have to understand them to the extent that you agree with them or like it, but can we understand it? And it's so much easier when it's not your child. It's so much easier being a therapist understanding your children than it is understanding mine at times. Because understanding means that I have to feel. Understanding means that I have to be vulnerable. Understanding means that I have to grieve and let go of control and not try to fix it. And that is incredibly painful. It means all of my feelings are with me. we become a student in this process. And we develop what Buddhists call the beginner's mind. Always listening, always learning. One of my therapists used to always say, be curious. Let's be curious about what's going on with your child all the time. And then, of course, the greatest insight, the greatest discovery that gives us access to other people is the depth of ourselves. The more we go inside here, the more we go inside the deep ocean or the dark forest or the scary cave that is talked about in all stories and myths, the more we go into that place and the more clear we get about who we are, the more easy we'll be able to see all the other parts of our children and others. So doing your own work gives you that kind of vision. I want to share this quote from a parent today who wrote to me. And in the midst of communicating something else, she shared this with me. She said, by the way, you've changed my life. Turn it upside down, actually. Big thanks. And this simple statement, that's what it feels like. What I'm really asking, what I'm really trying to do is turn everything upside down, is ask you to look at life differently than the way that you were raised. It doesn't make sense. And when you lose the old context and the old rules and the old shoulds and the old has tos and the old blaming and all of that old stuff, you're left with something quite frightening. You're left with just yourself and all the possibilities that life has. So when people talk about getting into therapy, when people talk about getting into an analysis, when our children, your students talk about getting into the program, the desperation that they have when they say, I can't do it, it's that. It's that experience of the nakedness of I don't have my defenses or my old distractions. And the parents that do it, it's even hard to put into words the change that occurs for you. It's hard to talk to friends who are still living in the old paradigm, who see things the old way, who have the old excuses, who blame the old things and people in life for their unhappiness. But it is, of course, the opportunity for an emotional and spiritual rebirth. The opposite of defenses, the synonymous idea with vulnerability is authenticity. Showing up as your naked self. It takes a lot of work. I had somebody tell me during fits that I was being courageous with a certain interaction that I had. And my response was, this isn't courageous for me. This isn't hard for me. I fought that battle months and years ago. This is easy for me now. And of course, there are challenges in my life today, but that's not one of them. And so becoming authentic, practicing authenticity, continuing to develop our authenticity becomes kind of a muscle. It provides connection for others and validation. I just consulted with one of our therapists on the phone this evening. And when I was talking to him, he was talking about a difficult diagnosis. And one of the things that I said was, it's a hard one. I don't know. I wish I had a better answer. I wish I had a magic solution, but this is a hard one. And I gave him some ideas, some questions to work with, but I said, I wish I had more. And he said to me, it's just good to have that reflected back to me because I thought I was not enough. I thought I was inadequate. And so when you say that, it gives me a sense of feeling okay about myself and feeling safe and feeling grounded. So when we're authentic, when I can show up in session or in a webinar, if I hurt your feelings, if you get frustrated and I can just say, I'm sorry, maybe I missed something, or I'm feeling insecure, or gosh, I want to fix you, but I know that I can't, but that's my anxiety. If I could just name it, name who I am, name what I am, and just be that thing, then there's no need for a defense and you can't attack me. What are you going to do if I just show up as myself? If I lie to you, if I hurt you, if I do something harmful or mean to you, and I just own where it comes from authentically, not for any other person's purpose, but just being real and showing up, what are you going to do? It feels foreign and out of control. It feels wrong at first to practice vulnerability and practice authenticity, but ultimately it is the best defense. I'll tell a few stories and then I'll get to some more principles. I've shared some of these before, and some of you have heard some of these. But I've told the story of this father who called me about his son. And he said, he'd been to the program, he was home now, and he was regressing back into some of his old behaviors. And the dad was incredulous about it. How could he do this? How could he regress back into some of the old behaviors? And he gave me some specific examples that were particularly colorful. And he said, so the other night I just couldn't stand it. So I went upstairs, and I know I'm not supposed to do this, Brad, but I went upstairs and I started lecturing at him and raising my voice, yelling at him. And I'm asking him, why are you doing this? And I said, well, here's what you can do now. Because here's the irony. You just did something that you know in your head is wrong, but you did it anyway. You know yelling and lecturing isn't the solution, but it feels somehow good to you, somehow comfortable to you, and you went up there and did it anyway. So why don't you go up to him and tell your son you know exactly why he's practicing old unhealthy behaviors, because you just did it. But we don't look at that. It's so much easier, as it says in the Knight in Rusty Armor, to see other people's armor and not our own. I had a mother call me after her son had graduated from our program, was graduating from a very great therapeutic boarding school, and they were getting ready and looking at colleges. And he came home for a home visit, and they had visited 3 colleges, not too close to home, but in the same state. And when she called me, I said, how's it going? What's going on? She said, well, some of the behaviors I saw in him sounded like the old, I'll call him Frank, the old Frank. But the most important thing is I responded differently. And that's what I'm calling to report on. That's what makes me happy in this process. And when I heard that, I was relieved. I was happy. I was excited for her, because she was doing what she needed to do as part of the system to create a healthy system, which is she was paying attention to her defenses. She was vulnerable with me. She was owning it. And she was able to look at her flaws and imperfections. I got triggered a couple of times. I started to go there, but then I recognized it and I stopped. At this FITS conference, one thing we did is we provided all of the professionals with a couple of hours, actually a few hours, of an experience. Not lecturing, not panel discussions, not a keynote address, not marketing, but actual experiences. We brought in several facilitators, and we broke them into small groups, and each of them were allowed to participate in or sit in a group where work was being done. Psychodrama was being done. Role plays were being done. Anger, fear, insecurity was being done. And everybody was amazed. Everybody showed up. It was so impressive. And one of the professionals said to me afterwards, he said to me, I want to go to one of these programs that you're talking about, Brad, either at Evoke or somewhere else where I can do my own work. But I'm afraid once I open up that they won't be able to put me back together, that I won't be able to be back together again. And in some ways, there's truth to that. Some ways, there's not. There's this experience that this gentleman had, that if he hurt, that if he cracked up, that he was going to go crazy. It is the darkest cave in his life, to look back and confront those issues. And that was his fear. And in that way, it was not necessarily rational or accurate. But it feels like that. That's the way it feels to him. And the way that it was accurate is you can't unsee, unlearn, unknow some of the things that you see, know, and learn when you get into your work. It will change you. You can't go backwards. That's why even with students and clients that are resistance, exposing them to the therapy at Evoke doesn't go away, although it might go dormant. If they had any kind of genuine experience, it doesn't go away. And it ruins their defenses, their drug using, their cutting, whatever it is. It ruins it, because they connect to that experience again and again and again. And eventually, it reemerges in them. Really, what we're asking people to do is cross over thresholds. Thresholds that we're sure are the wrong thresholds at time, or that threaten us, or that we're sure we're going to die emotionally, spiritually, physically. Cross over those thresholds. Some people call it having a breakdown, but really what it is, it's the opportunity for spiritual and emotional rebirth and growth. That's what we're asking your students to do, and that's a very tall order for children that aren't quite as developed and resourceful as you. But if you do this work, you can start to share in that experience with them and offer them support. So for you, and kind of the take home is showing up with your child. And what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to talk to them differently, because you'll think differently, because you'll be more aware. And your words and the selection of your words will matter, and they do matter. And part of it is not about your child. Part of it is the way that you are in the world. This message is not about your child. It's in the context of your child and parenting, but it's really about you. And healing and working on that and making that your project always creates a better person, a better parent in the process. And like I've said many times, the parents who most often rave about us aren't necessarily the parents all with the best outcomes in terms of how their child turned out, but they're the ones whose lives have been changed. And they come back to me and say, it wasn't just about my child's relationship. It's changed my work relationship, my couple's relationship, my friendship. It's changed my relationship with my ex-spouse, on and on and on. So part of it is about the words that you use, and part of it is about how you end the world. It will take work and discomfort, and in the end you will be transformed. Old things in you will die, and new things will be born. That is the gift of parenting a child struggling with mental health and addiction. And that is the invitation, the threshold that you're being asked to cross and enter into. This is hard work, and I have empathy, and I've been working on it in therapy and out of therapy since I was 8 years old, and I am going to be 48. So for 40 years I've been working on this. I don't feel done. I went to therapy today. Didn't have anything distressful to talk about, but it was still nice to reconnect to myself. It's that place that I go to reconnect to somebody who knows me, who can see me. And as of late, the nice part of it is it's been in the context of a lot of peace and serenity. It's something, this work that you're being asked to do, even raising a child struggling, it's something that the universe is offering to you, your higher power, life is offering to you, that you can't learn any other way, that you won't learn any other way, that you wouldn't be willing to go into those dark forests, those deep oceans, that desolate desert for any other reason. And you'll find a new self on the other side. You'll develop a new self. And what you'll also do is you'll create a safe space for loved ones and for others in life. And not to overstate it, but doing this work, practicing vulnerability, peeling back the layers in your own life, and in so doing, knowing your child and seeing them and what you're asking them to do, it'll change everything, is the promise. All right, Stephanie, are there any questions that I can address? A lot of this sounds like 12-step programs. Is there some kind of treatment approach you use? You know, I'm a fan of and informed by 12-step approaches. I'm also informed by attachment theory a lot. My therapist is informed by attachment theory. I've been trained as a family systems therapist. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I love the developmental and dynamic theories of dynamic psychology. So, and then I'm aware of cognitive behavioral theories, dialectical behavioral theories, behavioral theory. I'm aware of all of those. But probably most importantly, it's probably attachment theory. And then you're going to hear language from all of these other theories. I believe in object relations, which is a theory, kind of a dynamic theory that talks about how you can reduce a human being and the internalized objects that they have into them, and that they project out onto people in those relationships that they have. They kind of cast people in their place. So it's a lot of things. It's eclectic, but if it were just one thing, I would say attachment theory would be it. But I use 12-step a lot. When I was a newly fledged adult, I thought being strong was taking care of myself, which I interpreted as not asking for help. The turning point in my journey from adolescence into adulthood was realizing the greatest strength one can have is to be vulnerable. Now as a parent, I struggle with my vulnerability to my child's choices. So now I'm circling back to understand that taking care of myself is the grounding of my strength. Oh, what a journey life is. You know what? Not only is that beautiful because of the irony and the circle of it, but you're still growing. And next year, my webinars are going to sound different than this year, just a little bit. And 5 years from now, hopefully they'll sound different. And hopefully what I share that's consistent throughout them is this willingness to grow and to look and to ask questions and to think and to learn. So thank you for sharing that. I love all of this. Sometimes I slip into the therapist role with my daughter, despite my intentions. Can you explain the negatives of this way of relating to my daughter? She also has some fetal alcohol syndrome. You know, let me say it this way, because I'm a therapist, obviously, you know that, and I have children. And if I am in relationship with my client in the healthiest of ways, it's not that different with my child. Because I'm always trying to find my client. I don't know why it's doing that, Stephanie, but you can manage that. I'm always trying to find and understand and empathize. And I'm always realizing that I'm not the expert. And I'm always checking my countertransference of control and fear and shame, right? So, in some ways, responding to your child like a therapist means, for me, responding to them like a happy, enlightened, well adjusted person in my good moments. In my bad moments as a therapist, I'm manipulative, I am controlling, I have a hidden agenda, and I'm the expert, right? I'm wanting to fix them. I believe in those moments that they need to be shaped up and rearranged in some way to satisfy some need inside of me. So I would say it's not about therapist versus non therapist. It's about when I have my countertransference with my clients or my children in check. And so there to me is a tremendous amount of overlap in healthy therapizing and healthy parenting. And there is an extraordinary amount of overlap in unhealthy parenting and unhealthy therapeutic practice. But most of us think of therapists as people that are fixers and people that are managing something and changing something. And I don't think like that. I think that the client does it. And what I try to do is facilitate a process where they can find themselves. And I'm not the expert on their lives. I'm just the expert on not being something that gets in the way. So that's my thought about it. The negatives would be the same. The negatives would be the same about trying to control and fix my client as trying to control and fix my child. The unconscious message that they would feel at some level is you're broken, you're wrong, I know more than you do, I'm the expert, you're stupid, you're flawed, on and on and on. All of the exact opposite message that I wanted to teach them. Attachment theory is basically the understanding of how two human beings connect, right? So you can talk about the old studies with monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and attachment and what it meant, and healthy development, and some of the more modern examples like Jessica Benjamin and her work. It's the idea of how do I connect to you? How do I allow for attachment between us? How do I provide a safe container? How do I listen, see you, and understand you? How can I resonate and attune with you? And in parenting, in life, that's a long process, right? That happens over years. And in therapy, you're trying to recreate that attunement, right? The goal of my therapist every week is it's incredible. Same therapist, you know this, some of you, for 17 years that I've been going to. And she's just trying each week to know me, to see me, to understand me. And now it's easier, I'm sure in many ways, because she knows me. And then what I do, what my experience is I go there in a world that's sending me all kinds of messages that doesn't hear me, that doesn't respond to me, that can't contain me, that can't hear me. And so I get confused and I hear this noise and it resonates with the noises from my childhood where people didn't hear me, didn't see me, didn't understand me, couldn't contain me. And then I go once a week and I get found again. And when I get found, my anxiety reduces. I'm clear, I'm confident, I have serenity, and I can challenge the old scripts, the old echoes, the old messages in a healthy, clear way. So attachment theory is attachment between originally parent and child, but has been extrapolated now to therapy about creating a sense of it's the therapist that says the relationship is most important. The therapist that talks about the role of the therapist in the therapeutic relationship is going to be one of the most impactful things. The reason why attachment theory matters to me is because it speaks very well to the ideas of countertransference and transference, which are not about information or theory, but simply about resonance. And the thing that gets in the way of me resonating with you is not you. It is me. And so attachment theory requires the therapist or the parent to do their own work. Examples of study, there's a great chapter in the book, Nurture Shock, that talks about how they can interview mothers while they were pregnant with their children. And they basically what they did is they interviewed them about their history growing up, the mothers. And they could predict at 2 years, after the child is born, at 2 years old, with I think it was like an 80% success rate, they could predict the level of attachment, the quality of attachment, I should say, the quality of attachment between mother and child. 8 months pregnant, 7 months pregnant, so 2 years later, the research is based on this interview of the parent's childhood, could predict the quality of attachment. And by the way, the interview wasn't about the information. It was about how the parent was able to relate to their childhood, how they were able to make sense out of it. So if I can make sense out of, have awareness of my childhood and was and the impact on it, I can develop, provide for healthy attachment with that child. And there's a lot more to it, but nurture shock is something to talk about. I talk about in my book, and I'm gonna give that some publicity again tonight because it comes out in a few days. When I think about what we've been through with our son, I wonder what ought to be shared with him. I've had addiction problems and haven't wanted to tell him about it because of the power issue. Will he throw it in my face and use it to justify his behavior? He's home, he regrets, and I'm seeing a need tonight to do something different. Is being authentic also about being totally honest about things I've done? I'll share with you my experience. And I would encourage you to have a therapist to talk this out with, but I've been asked this question for 20 years now, and I always share it. My children have never blamed me for their behavior. But the worry that they're going to blame you is part of the power dynamic, right? All of my children, from the age of that we could talk about it, know of my history as an adolescent growing up. And the reason they don't blame me is because it wouldn't matter to me. I don't care if you blame me. I mean, I guess you could blame me because you got the same genes as me. And I've had children. I have varying ages of children. Some children who have struggled and some children who haven't. And I don't suspect ever will in this area. And none of them are struggling now, but it doesn't matter. If the act of justifying behavior is a part of his personality, it doesn't matter. He's going to do it no matter what. So your disclosure or not is irrelevant. And what I might do, and I would encourage you, let me qualify this. I hope you have a therapist. I hope you have somebody that can mentor you because I'm not your therapist. But what I would suggest you consider is tell him your story. And just say, I've been afraid and I've been trying to control you. I not only have had problems with drugs, but I'm also a control freak. I'm also codependent. And so I have not been telling you stuff because I wanted to control you. And now we wonder, and I laugh about as your father, why there's this control dynamic between us because I'm a part of it. And I'm starting to learn this. And I'm just giving you an example of, for instance, but that's how you might do it. But, addicts that are in recovery or people like myself who are not in recovery but that do this work and that share with their children, we don't care. And if our children blame us, it's not about us. And they're going to blame us anyway if they're going to blame us. They're going to find something to blame us. Blame only works when the other person reacts to it. When the other person has some experience, whether they deny it or not, when they're triggered by it. In fact, if somebody blames you and you're not triggered by it, you don't care. And if somebody blames you and you are triggered by it, you try to talk yourself out of it or argue or tell them not to justify it or talk about how irresponsible or unaccountable they are because you're defended, because you're feeling threatened. So it is an entire paradigm shift, for sure. So I'd encourage you to consider it, and then I hope you have somebody who can talk and help you walk through it. It never has affected me as a therapist or a parent to this day to share my faults, frailties, limitations with any of my clients or any of my... I've had parents come to me. I've had parents from these webinars come to me and say they don't necessarily trust me as much because I go to therapy, or they don't trust me as much because I make mistakes. But that's not about me. The vast majority of clients and parents have said it makes them feel safe, makes them feel okay, makes them feel not crazy, helps them to know that we're all in this together. But oh, I thought it was the same question. My daughter's home now and we are both doing some good work in communicating and understanding each other. I still struggle and am triggered by provocative clothing, my stuff. How do I express my concern without making her feel bad about herself? It takes time to tip her scale of intrinsic value, but how do I respond in the meantime? We don't share feelings with our children. We don't share feelings with our children so that they will change their behavior. So just own it. You can feel anything, and you will feel a lot of things. Just own it. It's always yours. It's never a mistake to own your feelings. And if I, as your child, hear you share things and you're owning it, I'm more willing to look at myself. If I feel like you're telling me that you're upset or triggered so that I will change, I'm more likely to feel threatened by that because I need to develop a separate sense of self. And if my self is going to be swallowed up by your feelings, if my self is going to be swallowed up by what your shame is, by what you need, then I am ultimately very, very threatened. So you can share with your children, but own it. You might also share with a therapist or share with somebody else and not share with them at times. But it's not your children's job or my children's job. I talk about this all the time to change their behavior so you're not triggered. That's not their job. And then, of course, you're allowed to have limits and consequences. And the more, I say this in the book, the more you can share, use communication skills to share, the more present you can be, and the more flexible you can become in your responses. And the message is never necessarily don't share with your children feelings. The message is own it. I will say to my children at times, I'm angry, especially my older ones, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm sad, I'm scared, but it's mine, it's not yours. Oh, and then they'll apologize and try to change. I say, no, it's not yours. You don't have to do anything. I'm just telling you so I can get it out there, so I can own it, then I can move through it, move past it, and then I can make a decision that's healthy. Most of the time, it is a non-decision. So you could just name it like this, but own it. And you're right, it's your stuff. Now, is she wearing clothing that is an indication of some other issue? Maybe, absolutely maybe. That's not the question. But that's a different discussion than your fear and your anxiety. Besides, you don't want to program your children to respond to your emotions as if it's something they need to take care of, because then they're going to have horrible relationships with peers and partners and spouses and their children. They'll be programmed to think that other people's feelings are theirs, the same way that all of us are programmed to think that when our children are upset with us, that it's about us, instead of seeing our children. So that was a little bit of a rant, but it made sense to me. Do you feel that all psychological issues stem from a fractured attachment? Two things. It's this simple. There is genetics, right? There is what is nature. And then there is a context. And it's the interplay, interaction between the two of them. So people don't come with the same genetics, with the same brains, with the same hormones, with the same bodies. So that is a predisposing factor that is. And then they're introduced into a context. Part of our job is to understand the interplay between the two. Part of our job, when we can understand the context as clearly as possible, and so can the child or the parent for that matter, then we can begin to parse out what's going on with the brain, what's going on with the genetics, what's going on with thinking disorders, or what's going on, with thinking patterns, or with processing issues, or with depression or anxiety, or what's going on in the brain. So no, I think that fractured attachment is, I think it's relevant in every family. It's relevant in my family. I mean, I have 4 children, and there's fractured attachments at times to a varying degree because I'm human. And I'm not walking around with a great deal of shame about it, and I'm not walking around excusing myself. I work my butt off on it every day, and I fail every day. And that failure doesn't lead me to exonerate myself and bury my head in the sand and give up, or to beat myself up. It just is, it's the dialectic that I embrace. So there's fractured attachments in all of our families. We all were raised by human beings. We all weren't seen all the time. Very few human beings really listen and contain. And almost nobody can do it all the time because they don't have the resources all the time. So yeah, it's a piece of the picture. Absolutely. But there's other things that contribute to issues for sure. How do I work on something with my son if he refuses to communicate about the issue? He is communicating. I mean, let me say this. You can have boundaries. Okay, you can have boundaries and limits. Your empathy and your understanding and what I'm talking about tonight should not compromise, should not rob you and your family of boundaries. So let me say that first, okay? Secondly, patience and listening and demonstrating that you're safe and understanding that teenagers don't communicate. When I say teenagers, young adults don't communicate. And so part of your patience, my son was not a very big communicator. He was he was at our program for 16 weeks. He didn't write me a letter for several. And he wasn't even in that much trouble, and he wasn't even that symptomatic. Most of you, if I described the symptoms that led me to choosing him to send, would say, you were overreacting. So he was not a communicator. He was young, 14. He was not a communicator, even with the therapist and with the group. And part of it was my impatience. And I can be pretty intense, and I can talk too much. And I have high expectations. And so there's a process, I think, where we do a little bit less. I used to call it the grocery store lecture, where I would have a 20-second or 30-second conversation with my son while we were grocery shopping, and then I would change the subject. Where I stopped trying to pry him open. Where I stopped just owning my stuff and walking away. Where I was the one to end the conversation more than he was. There's a question in my book, a section of a chapter in the book that talks about this exact question. How do we get children, how do we get teenagers, young adults to open up to us when they're resistant to talking at all? And then I list all of these examples of ways that we can create safety. If I was my child, it would be miserable for me to open up to me, to talk to me. Because I have all the answers and I have all these lectures and I'm this and I'm that and I take up so much space. And just know that and be patient. And then I got to the point with my son and now with my daughters where even a lie that he told me, I welcomed because I was just glad that he was talking. And I realized I didn't have to correct it or confront it. Now, people at different places, but that's how non-communicative he was. And really what I was doing in a behavioral sense is I was rewarding successive approximations. And some of the things that we do that make it unsafe is we correct our children. We talk over them. We lecture. We have too many answers. We have too many explanations. We're too much of an expert. We look for everything that they do and an opportunity to correct or teach them or point out how they're immature or unwise, right? There's so much that we do, I do, Brad does, that makes it unsafe for my children. Own that, work on that, focus on that, look at that, talk about that a little bit with them. Understand that developmentally, that to protect them sense of self, that's what they're doing. And you know, when my son came to me, I told the story and told me that he lied on a job application. This was later on in our development. And I just listened and said, I'll be curious to see how that works. That's him beginning to learn Dad's safe. And a week later when he came back and he told them that he told them the truth and because his friend told him to and they wouldn't hire him because of it, even though they had offered him the job based on the lie. And I said, oh, okay. See, now I'm beginning to be safe because I'm being a good therapist. Right? Therapy isn't advice giving. Parenting isn't advice giving. Therapy is containment. Look at the webinar on containing it if you don't know what that is. All right, I'm going to have to, if we have any leftover questions, I'll get to them. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to pub this on the end of these webinars. It goes on, it gets shipped. In fact, it's being shipped today by Barnes & Noble and by Amazon. It'll be shipped in the next day or so. But go to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. Here's my new book. A lot of things we talked about are in it. I'm very happy with it. It's taken years to get here, and I'm excited. And in fact, I was number 12 last night on the hot new releases for parenting on Amazon.com. Wasn't a bestseller. It's a very small category, but I was excited to see that. I'm going on TV in Utah tomorrow, Monday, and Tuesday. I'm going to be on Sirius 106 on Saturday morning at 10:30 Mountain Time with Judith Regan. She has a show on 106 Sirius. She's my publisher, and she's going to be interviewing me on 10:30 my time, 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 Pacific on Sirius 106. Okay, upcoming workshops. Paul Goddard's workshop, hosted at our Entrada program. Email gail@evoketherapy.com. It's probably late if you haven't made plans yet. The family intensive. If you haven't seen the blog that was written by one of our families that attended our first intensive, go check it out. This is one that will be hosted by me. You can email Stephanie@evoketherapy.com, or you can go to the program page and look at the intensives. But it's going to fill up. We've already had some people sign up for it, so it's going to fill up before too long. You don't have to have a child at Evoke. You don't have to visit your child. You don't have to come as a couple. If you're not together, it's okay if just one of you come. If you have any questions, you can email me or Stephanie there. So we're looking forward to that. It's a powerful, powerful experience. Parent support groups coming up. We'll be listing more next week, but so far we have Austin, Texas. There are the dates. Notice the different email addresses there if you're going to RSVP, and we do need to have RSVP. Those of you in Los Angeles that wanted something in the Valley, we're having something in the Valley this time. It's not on the west side, so we hope you can come. And those of you in Orange County who always ask for an Orange County meeting, we're having one in Orange County. So please attend there. Here are the places you can go for groups. Here's our social media. Please like us on social media so you can see about announcements without always getting emails. And then the next webinar will be the open forum this Monday, the 20th, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Any leftover questions from this webinar, I'll answer then. Thank you so much for your attendance and for your questions and for your heart and for joining us. And thank you, Stephanie, for moderating. I hope these are helpful, and I will talk with you back on Monday evening at 6:30 p.m. the 20th. Take care. Bye-bye.